Okay, so we're live. Good afternoon and welcome to Implementing Effective Subcontractor Management Arrangements. This is a joint webinar in association with FIN, the Fellowship of Inspection Nominees, and e-Memoir. And today we're joined by Peter, Stacey and Beej Kaczmarczyk. As ever, we like to keep these webinars as interactive as possible, so feel free to use the question or chat facility at any point throughout the duration of this webinar. So again, you don't have to wait to the end to put any questions to us. If you're watching this on the video recording and you have any questions or thoughts, contact details will be available on the final slide, and I'd encourage you to get in touch with us. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Peter and Beej. Thanks a lot.
Thanks very much, Manik. Thank you, and good afternoon to everyone that's listening in, particularly to our regular subscribers and customers, and welcome to those of you who are perhaps new and fresh to our series of webinars. We're doing today's webinar in association with the Fellowship of Inspection Nominees, and Peter will introduce himself in a minute, and then after Peter's done that, I'll introduce myself, and at that point we'll also turn off the video so you're not distracted by our faces while the actual content is being looked at. So without further ado, let me just hand over to Peter, who will introduce himself.
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. So Peter Stacey. Worked for many years as a manager in the education and skills sector, you know, whether it be in colleges, with private training providers, local authorities, employability providers, and in fact in offender learning, before moving on to the inspection service. And when I retired from that a couple of years ago, I now focus upon supporting training providers with their delivery and strengthening leadership and management. So that's me.
Great. That's great. Thanks very much, then, Peter. Thank you. And Peter's contact details will be available after this webinar, should you want to get in touch with them. For those of you who don't know me, Beej Kaczmarczyk, I'm Chair of Governors at a medium-sized college in East Midlands, also on the board of directors at two private training companies, both of whom are subcontractors, but also both of whom are directly funded for study programs, adult education budget, for loans and for apprenticeships. So I've got my foot in both camps as a prime, but also as a subcontractor. So hopefully that understanding and knowledge will help you. The theme's very much about the management of subcontracting in these very difficult circumstances. So whatever context you're coming to us today, we're assuming that you might be a prime with, say, one or two subcontractors. You might be a subcontractor trying to get the very best partnership with your prime, the best form of managing your contract, particularly in the delivery of study programs, adult education budget, and apprenticeships. So that's very much the theme, but also taking account, as Peter said, of what's very important in the new education inspection framework, which I think sets a new context for the management of subcontracting and is a key aspect of your leadership and management, as well as over the total quality of your curriculum offer. So at this point, I think Marek will dispense with the videos. You can see that we're here. Just a few words about FIN, Peter, before we get going.
Yeah, just to say FIN, the Fellowship of Inspection Nominees, is a membership organisation. It has around about 100 members now. So it's to support education and training providers with improving the quality of the work they undertake and also how they manage that provision. And to ensure as well, not just improving the quality, but to make sure organisations don't sleepwalk into a future inspection, but that they're inspection ready. Membership provides access to specialist support, various training events, which often have an Ofsted inspector in attendance to give their perspective and give their support, and a range of extensive resources to support providers in their work. So membership provides a considerable amount of benefits. And I would say as well that any training provided by FIN, including webinars, is given to members at no charge. So it's an all-inclusive membership fee. And if we move on to the next slide, Beej, what we can see there is, you know, it's helping providers be ready for inspection and what inspection brings, because we know the consequences of an inspection not going the way we want. You've got a lot of experience in there from people who have been inspectors or inspection managers, and you've got people who've been nominees on numerous occasions to bring that experience to the fore. So FIN is an organisation, membership organisation. I can give you more details at the end of this webinar and how you can join FIN, but the benefits are clearly considerable.
That's great. Thanks very much, Peter. So what we're going to be looking at in the course of the next 50 minutes or so with you, between myself and Peter, is really, this is if you want the set of content details. We're going to open up a little bit on the subcontracting debate and some of the facts and figures there. Peter will then pick up the benefits and reasons for subcontracting, and then we'll get into the core of today's webinar, which is looking at how to effectively manage your subcontracting relationship, partnerships, and that's it starts with obviously making sure that you undertake effective due diligence, how to support your subcontractors in an effective partnership way, and we'll spend a bit of time looking at that. The importance of performance management and reporting, which obviously will be critical in terms of audit and of compliance. Peter will then focus a fair bit on Ofsted expectations relating to subcontracting, and then hopefully we'll pull everything together with obviously our experience, but also taking account of questions that you might have posed, and then identify some other support that will be available to you in hints and tips for you if you're a prime, and hints and tips for you if a subcontractor. And we'll take questions as we go along throughout the webinar. So a start point, really some facts and figures. If you're looking at the 2017-18, the last complete year, there was a grand total of about £650 million worth of government funding for subcontracting provision and delivery. And a large chunk of that was the ESFA. But it actually came to about 10.6% of the total of ESFA funding. And that is mostly for adult learning and apprenticeships. Over 570,000 learners were on subcontracted provision. And that, by the way, includes just over 25,000 16 to 19-year-olds who are either fully funded or partially funded on, for example, traineeships or other shorter programs. This actually means that there's about 674 prime providers subcontracting provision to just over 2,200 subcontractors. So it's a very important, if you want, element and aspect of the FE and skills context. And I suppose from my point of view, being involved both as a prime but as a subcontractor, we see it as a very important element in the provision of FE provision and skills provision for young people and adults, which when done properly and when managed properly is adding a lot of value and benefit. But those are very important conditions. And obviously we want to look at how important effective management is of those contracts. The debate obviously centers around a whole set of issues, some of which we'll pick up, some which have been picked up in other webinars. So why subcontract? Why should a contractor who's already either grant funded or contract funded subcontract the provision to a third party? And we want to look at what we call the positive reasons for that. And clearly in the consultation, which Peter will pick up with you, one of the things we're trying to get away from there is only financial reasons. So it could be about the extension of learning, about a niche market, about attracting those learners who would not normally be attracted, or other positive benefits for learners and for the wider society. So we need to know what the benefits are. We need to know whether subcontracting is value for money, and that starts to raise the issue of management fees, which I know many of your subcontractors are concerned about, having management fees which are a disproportionate element of the price that you've agreed with the main provider. And so that bound to raise issues about, well, if good provision can be delivered at 80% of the cost of the funding model, then why not fund it all at 80%? Raises some very interesting issues. How good is the quality is very much a key issue here. It's what benefits come, what value is added by subcontracting provision, and that making sure that there's no dilution or diminution of quality, as well as obviously meeting the important audit and inspection requirements, including compliance. I think this raises some very fundamental questions about what is the future of subcontracting. And what I'm saying is we can assure subcontracting is a good future if we get all of the key elements, obvious benefits to learners, obvious benefits to skills development, and obviously good quality management and good outcomes for learners, as well as a good quality of the curriculum. So I think that's where the debate very much centers, and it won't obviously be resolved today. But there are some changes which have already impacted on subcontracting. I know that some of you listening in were subcontractors who are now being directly funded, partly because of the opening up of the adult market and apprenticeship markets to more providers, as long as you're going onto the register of training organisations or apprenticeship training providers. And obviously what's helped here is the procurement process, which could be extended. And for example, the procurement process that worked for the devolution of AEB has meant that some subcontractors are now directly funded, and that's obviously impacted on the number of subcontractors. I think the removal of whole program subcontracting apprenticeships has also changed the profile here, and that this is a good quality movement to make sure that the whole of a program cannot be delivered without the involvement of the prime contractor in some significant and substantial way. I think the opening up of the apprenticeship service, although a lot of these things that we're going to talk about, and Peter will highlight this, the plans and intentions, of course, could be affected by what's happening in terms of the coronavirus. But the opening up of the apprenticeship service to non-levy employers means that they have access to a wider range of providers as long as they're on the register of apprenticeship training providers. We all know about the revised rules and regulations, and we've covered those in previous webinars. For example, the apprenticeship rules for main providers, August 2019 to July 2020, highlighted, for example, the importance of transparency, of looking at key issues around management of the quality and the monitoring of the activity itself. This has all led to a greater transparency in subcontracting arrangements. I know many of us were very concerned that before Christmas we were asked to include a lot more information which we would publish on our websites and give to the ESFA. Although let me just add, the ESFA itself has not been as forthcoming with that information. For example, the up-to-date information on subcontracting in England. And then, of course, the challenges of the new education inspection framework, which Peter will focus on, and that greater emphasis on the quality of the curriculum, on having a clarity of intention, of implementation and impact, which Peter will pick up. And just before I hand over to Peter, just a couple of things just to highlight the expectations of how well, and this was in the documents that obviously were produced just before Christmas, that the ESFA, and these are obviously subject to review after 18 months, has a clarity about what its requirements of providers are. So that's clear descriptions before the subcontracting relationship is agreed, what's going to be provided by us in terms of our management side as the prime, and that's the specific cost of managing the subcontractor, quality monitoring activities in much more detail than was maybe required before. That greater transparency is a cost to us in terms of time and effort, but at the same time does make us consider and evaluate the quality of our management of the subcontracting relationship. Also tells the subcontractor exactly what to expect, and so is an important part of those service level arrangements. And making sure that all costs are individually itemized, and those costs are then described, and of course how they add to high quality learning rather than detract from it. And I think that's obviously a concern that the ESFA and others have had. So I think that the clarity in terms of what's expected from the subcontracting agreement, contract, whatever, is very clear. However, there's much more needed, and Peter, we'll hand over to you now.
Thank you very much, Beej. There's been a recent consultation which you may have contributed to or been aware of, which closed a short while ago. And when consultations come out, often it tells me that there's a clear view as to how people want to take things forward, but they'll put it out into consultation, and then there may be certain responses that kind of alter their thinking. You know, and it can alter thinking. I was thinking about the consultation which took place with regard to the education inspection framework, where the intention was to not report specifically on high needs, but the sector said, we do want you to report on high needs. So that came into the inspection framework, and now high needs receives a separate grade on inspections. So that's where kind of public consultation can actually change the original views. But if we look at the recent consultation, you can see what's coming out of this. What the aim is is to have better management of the subcontracting process. It's to reduce risk. It's to establish clear guidelines, reduce the level of subcontractors, and only have subcontracting that's for the benefit of learners and not simply for financial benefits. So you can see, pull all that together, we're looking at a reduced level of subcontracting, hopefully that it's going to be at a very high level and justified as to why it's taking place, but there's going to be a high level of accountability as to how things are managed. So really that's the aim of the consultation, with the intention of taking it forward to get a much better but reduced product. If we just move on to the next slides, Beej, and you can see there what's coming out of it. The first proposal put forward was, as you can see there, about subcontracting being approved by governors or the board. So really there it's an organisation taking their subcontracting responsibilities seriously, that it's signed off by the board, and it's published on the website, which puts the subcontracting arrangements into the public domain. So it's not just taken at senior management level, this is signed off by the governing body. There's going to be a limit on the distance that a subcontractor can be from the prime contractor. Now that sounds a bit odd. You know, when you look for examples of that, they were talking about 1.5 hours drive or 2 hours drive. Well, you can put that into what, a 50 miles, 100 miles radius? A strange one they brought in there. But what they're looking at there is that the provider has close geographical contact with the subcontractor. Whether or not that's going to come through at the end, I don't know. And it was a strange one for that to be actually raised.
And I think the other argument there, Peter, was that learners would know who the prime was and have some relationship with the prime rather than have all of the relationship with a subcontractor.
Yes. And, you know, if we look back, we can all give examples of where it might be a learner in Devon undertaking a first aid course was enrolled as a student with a college in the northeast of England. You know, when you're thinking, it's a strange arrangement, this. So they're trying to put in some geographical criteria as well. The third point there is about reducing volumes, initially getting it down to 25% of the prime contractor's work being put out to subcontractors, but then over time, reducing that to 10% on the value of the provision that can be subcontracted. For some providers, this is a significant change, a revolutionary change, because I can think of some providers where the vast majority of their provision is actually delivered by a third party.
Peter, there's a question just on that point from one of our local authority colleagues here, who actually subcontracts 100% of their provision. Do you think that is there going to be any special categories, for example, local authorities, voluntary sector organisations, where that 25% will certainly will be less of an issue because of the very nature of what their relationship is to the subcontractors?
I would anticipate that how a local education authority or local authority gives out the contract to a range of providers who've got the specialist skills to deliver their needs, that would have some particular arrangements for that to be justified. So we'll have to see what's forthcoming on that. But you can see, local authority might not deliver the program itself, but work with a lot of local specialists to deliver a program that meets the needs of their community. I think that would have to go through some justification, and if it was quality assured and delivered to a high quality, then you could see how approval could be given for that.
And you can see also that in the consultation, one of the areas that they had most concern about was primes who acted only as a managing agent, which obviously they don't really want to have. But I think that the point that you made there was relevant, is very much the local authority provision, things like the adult education budget, and of which sometimes obviously is co-funded as well through ESF. The ESF isn't part of this consultation, so I think that might be where some of that may be looked at separately. I think the issue here is in the current circumstances, given we're all trying to crystal ball what's going to happen in future, I think that will be one area that will be, as Peter said, subject to maybe further discussion.
Certainly. And I think the next point there talks about that. That subcontracting would have to be justified to the ESFA, and that's where perhaps local authorities would do that.
And certainly on the last point there about volume control, certainly, you know, in one of my director roles, we've got well over 3 million subcontracting coming to us. So we would certainly be concerned if the maximum value was only 3 million. Again, as Peter said, it's not so much about the volumes, it's about the quality of how well that contract is managed and what outcomes you get for the learners.
Yes, and you know, Beej, I don't want to go bashing subcontractors. There are some great subcontractors out there. And there are some great primes doing a great job of quality assuring the work of those subcontractors. There's some excellent practice out there. We know, though, that history has told us there's some very weak practice out there. And what I think these new arrangements are trying to do is to make it much tighter and make sure we've got consistently good practice taking place, which will be at a lower volume unless by special arrangement.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the points that one of our listeners has already put, for example, if you're involved in a lot of national provision, which often is the case, is that as long as the quality is good, as evidenced by inspection and by other quality indicators, then, you know, geographical distance might be a factor for some, but less so. For example, in the current climate, where so much online learning is occurring, just being distributed nationally, you know, some of these controls, such as distance, would be irrelevant, wouldn't they?
Certainly so. And if you're a national provider, I mean, the key challenge, if you've got provision that's spread across the country, it's the 2 C's, the consistency and communication.
Yeah, exactly.
If you've got those working effectively, you know, is it true to say that if provision is further away from head office, it's weaker? Not necessarily so. No evidence to support that.
No, it's sometimes anecdotal, isn't it, Peter?
It is. You know, what you will find if provision is widespread, you will have inconsistencies. You'll have probably some excellent local practice. You'll have something which is less so.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, you know, what's coming forward is a direct contractual relationship between a lead provider and a subcontractor. So no longer just a service level agreement that might be pretty loose. It's really tying it down to what's expected. You know, so the expectations, the responsibilities, the accountabilities. One set of funding rules for subcontracting, because I know there can be a variety of payments that are made from primes to subcontractors. You know, Beej mentioned 20%. I know in some cases figures going way above that in terms of what is taken off by the prime before passing on to subcontractors. So looking at one set of funding rules to justify the services that the prime is providing to the subcontractor. To put all this information into the public domain is another proposal that's going to be there. So people or subcontractors won't be off the radar. They'll be very much on the radar. Some subcontractors, weaker subcontractors in the past, have used the off the radar scenario for some weaker, you know, some weak and poor practice. And because they've not been picked up by Ofsted on inspection or not directly on a ESFA audit, then they've got away with that poor practice. That wouldn't be allowed to happen in future. An interesting point is that penultimate one there about introducing an externally assessed standard for the management of subcontracting. And I'm thinking there, is that something which the ESFA would create, an award to primes, or is it something where we'd have an external body that comes in and gives a quality mark, you know, such as Matrix for the quality of information, advice and guidance, or invested in people, or a quality mark for employer engagement? That might be something which ESFA might, and I'm just saying might, say that if you're going to subcontract, then you need to have this quality mark, be assessed against this quality standard to be able to do that. Just like if you're delivering employability training and look to get people into kind of employment, you'd expect it to have the Matrix standard. Last point there, timescales. Well, where do timescales stand at the moment on lots of things? The changes are going to be started being implemented for the next contract year. I think there'll be some drift on that. You know, from the 25% down to the 10% was due to come in over a period of 2 or 3 years. That might be stretched out a little bit as well, as we're in uncharted territory at the moment.
Yeah, Peter, I think there's a couple of things on that slide. One, you're right. I think at the beginning of this month that the ESFA was indicating that there might be some slippage on those changes, both in terms of initiating them and, as you said, it may be extending the time that's going to take before the transition is fully effected. It's very similar to our request at the moment to delay the transition from frameworks to standards. So I think you're right that that might slip. The second issue, I think, just to pick up, is that while the ESFA is talking about changing the requirements for subcontracting, particularly for things like AAB and traineeships, of course, we've got to remember that almost half of AAB is now devolved to the combined mayoral authorities and delegated to Greater London. Now, of course, they might want to initiate their own, if you want, rule changes for subcontracting or their own requirements. That would be an interesting contradiction, possibly, because how would that contrast if the national rule for one part of your contract was different from the devolved rule? Could we see some confusion?
Possibly. It's how things can be justified. Certainly, an approval's got to be given for that, but you could see some kind of little bit of contradiction. I suppose at the end of the day, Beej, if the aim is to get high quality provision at probably a better managed level, then how that's achieved may have some flexibility within it.
Yeah, and I think also the point you made is that if we do have an externally assessed standard, then to some extent, would that be on top of what we expect auditors to do, particularly external auditors, and what we'd expect Ofsted to do, as well as the Institute for Apprenticeships and any other quality assurance, as you said, such as Matrix? Would this sit on top of it, or would it be replacing it? Yeah?
Yeah, an interesting one, that, you think about an Ofsted inspection, where if as an organisation you've gone through a rigorous matrix assessment, you think or you feel you can approach an Ofsted inspection and be confident you're going to get a strength around your information, advice and guidance. Doesn't always happen, does it? But if you've got an issue, which is your subcontracting arrangements have had specific scrutiny, and you've been given a kite mark that says you're doing that to a pretty competent level, then I'd like to think that would be evidence that Ofsted inspectors would take on board to say that subcontracting arrangements are at the standard expected.
Yeah. So, okay, well, that's great. Thanks very much for the questions we're getting there. I'll move us on now. So, Peter, what are the reasons that you think are good reasons for subcontracting?
If we talk about subcontracting, often it was undertaken, and let's be honest about this, for financial benefit, where subcontractor might approach a prime and say, we can sign up this number of learners, we can guarantee this number of starts, and they talk about the high quality of their provision, and on that basis, a prime would go along with the subcontracting arrangement. It can't be about finance anymore, even though we know there's got to be a financial justification for all the work we do. Otherwise, we won't be financially viable. So we've got to make sure that the sums add up, as well as the good intention. Clearly, it's got to be for learner benefit. So let's look about some of these learner benefits. Geographical reasons. It might be that you're a very good provider and you want to set up some provision in a particular location where you don't really have a presence. But in that area, there's an organisation that's particularly strong, let's say, in health and social care training. So you want to go in with that organisation because they know the employers, they know the learners, they know the area, they know the community, and they're more able to meet the community needs. You might think that's a justification for going into that particular area where you've got no presence. So it's for geographical reasons. It could be for specialist provision or specific expertise, where you say, we're a very good deliverer of occupational training skills, but we're not great at delivering maths and English. So we'd like to work with a provider who has those skills. It might be for information, advice and guidance that you subcontract out. It might be that there are particular skills out there that you want to access that you think would benefit your learners. So you'll subcontract out parts of your provision. It might be that the on-the-job training is carried out in one area, but by one organisation, but the off-the-job means going to a local college, for example, the off-the-job underpinning knowledge, theoretical training. So there are reasons there. I think the key one there is the fourth one, where I don't tend to see subcontractors as being an external entity that are working to a separate set of criteria. They are partners. And to use an old expression, which sounds a bit glib, but we are all in this together, that if your subcontractor fails, your partner fails, you fail. If you fail, your subcontractor fails. So it's working together to make sure that we're going to get the best possible outcomes. That we're not in a blame game. We've got to work to make sure that the subcontractor provision is as strong as the prime. I mean, to be honest, I've seen situations where the subcontractor has been the strongest of the partnership, where the subcontractor has actually been better performing than the prime. What we've got to make sure is we work together to make sure there's consistency in what we do. That it's a genuine demand that you feel you cannot meet. If you can meet the demand, why are you actually putting that work out to an external organisation? It could be that you're approved by a provider with a great product, but they can't directly pull down funding. So I don't know whether this is going to be a temporary measure before they can become a prime contractor in their own right, but it's looking at what they've got to offer, which is something over and above what you can do, which will be a great benefit to your learners, employers, and the community in which you work. And there may be other reasons as well, but the other reasons, remember, have to be for the educational and training benefits, not simply financial. Nothing wrong with doing well by doing good. You know, if you offer a high quality product, the reward for that is that you'll have some financial advantage out of that. But we've got to deliver a high quality product, and that's your justification for subcontracting.
And a couple of comments there, Peter, before we move on. One is that basically you're saying that the relationship should be strategic and medium to long term, rather than just simply a short term filling of a financial gap. And I think we know that that's exactly the case. And another point here to make is it's absolutely critical that these reasons are also clearly understood and discussed by the board, whether it be the governing body or the board of directors if you're a training company, or the local authority. So that, you know, this comes from the very top. The commitment, it comes from the very top.
Management is key on this. You know, I hear some providers, I talk to a lot of providers across the sector who say to me, great, inspections out the way, we did well. So we feel like putting quality on the back burner now and really pushing on and looking to expand. And I often say, just take a step back. If you're going to grow, you've got to have managed growth. You've got to be able to control that growth and make sure you can deliver to a high standard. Because so many organizations have gone for rapid growth, you know, bring in short-term money, have the short-term financial benefit, but it's come back to haunt you later when the quality has declined considerably.
Okay, so a nice open question then to those who are listening in. In addition to the reasons that Peter's articulated there, can you see any other reasons why you would enter into subcontracting arrangements, either as a prime, or why would, as a subcontractor, would you be looking to work with a prime if you've got a good offer already and don't and are not contemplating, for example, being directly funded? Although I know there are some issues around that. So any other reasons for subcontracting? If you can just give us a quick heads up, if there's any, if you just use the chat facility or the Q&A, we get any. We've got one or two. Yeah, geographic can be within an hour's drive, but we just don't have a presence maybe in a local community. So yes, it doesn't have to be totally geographically dispersed. It could just be you don't have, maybe the learners prefer to just travel a very short distance to a local provision, which isn't yours, but you could subcontract it. Yeah, that's good. And
we know when we talk to local authorities on their AEB work, that, you know, we talk about putting the provision where the communities are and where the learners are.
Yeah,
you know, and it can apply to occupational areas and apprenticeship training as well.
Yeah, specialist provision, particularly when you're asked to do it by someone that's maybe already commissioning you to do other things, but you don't actually offer it. In other words, they want the relationship with you as a prime, and you could then subcontract the specialist provision to them, but they would still see that relationship with you as being critical. Remember, just one little point on subcontracting apprenticeship: the employer must agree to the use of that subcontractor. That's a part and parcel of any contractual arrangements you have. So I just wanted to just reaffirm that. Thank you for that. Okay. Any other reasons? Responding to Ellie, local employment partnership priorities and strategies. Yes, this could raise some significant issues in future, where the LAP, the LEPs or the combined authorities identified new demands, new skills that are needed, etc. Good. Subcontractor building capacity for quality assurance for future strategic growth using a prime as a development agent. I think that's a very good reason. Certainly that's one that we would certainly encourage subcontractors to do. Peter, you're going to say something on that one?
No, I agree entirely. I think that's justified. It's Helen who raised that point. And yeah, I think that's total justification. I mean, a question I'm sometimes asked is that providers often say, we don't employ these staff direct, but we bring in specialist staff who we bring in when they are required to work for us. Are they subcontractors? And the answer to that is no. They are staff who work for you. They might be on a call-in basis, but it's almost kind of equivalent to agency staff, where you employ their specialist skills when you need them. So they are not subcontractors. They are specialist staff that you call upon as and when required.
I think that point that Helen made is absolutely vital. Certainly we know it from our point of view, when originally we were 100% funded by subcontracting and now it's only about a third of our funding, was how important that building up the relationship with a good prime was in us actually developing our own QA, our own management capability so we could take on contracts directly. So I think it's a great point.
In fact, just to focus on that again, often as a subcontractor, it may be you're a brand new organization and you're new to apprenticeships, you're pretty new to adult education, and it's your quality assurance arrangements and management arrangements might be quite fragile and immature. And through learning from the prime and the support from the prime, you can strengthen what you do until you're ready to go and receive your own funding. I agree totally.
So what do we need to do to manage this effectively?
I put there Captain Hindsight. We can all think of Captain Hindsight, can't we? We've all been Captain Hindsight. Afterwards, where you say, after the event, you say, if only, or why did we do that? What I'm saying here is be wise before the event rather than afterwards looking back with regret. Sometimes we can sleepwalk into things where we were kind of naive to think that things would go well and we didn't do our checks. So what I'm saying is if you're going to go into a subcontracting arrangement, I suppose this could work both ways to a certain extent.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you're a prime looking at bringing on a subcontractor to deliver your work, or you're a subcontractor wanting to work with a prime, to research your provider, look at the previous work they've undertaken, whether it be the volumes, whether it be the quality. So you're looking at their track record. Check any available reports. Things you can do, talk to the providers, partners they may work with or may have worked with. Get to know their senior management team and, importantly, their governance arrangements. How rigorous are their governance arrangements? How accountable are they? What's their reputation? Now, sometimes reputations can be quite false, but reputation is what's often built up over a period of time and can have some credibility and validity, but you're going to dig into what their reputation is with employers, with previous learners, with the community across the sector. What resources do they have to deliver? Is this a training provider that has no training facilities and doesn't actually employ any staff? Would you be comfortable going into some partnership arrangement with them? What are their quality assurance arrangements? Now, it might be that you think their quality assurance arrangements are pretty strong. So what you can do is simply sample their quality assurance arrangements and piggyback on the back of those to make sure things are working well. Or they may be non-existent. So you've got to do a lot of quality assuring and monitoring and making sure improvement actions are put into place. The last point there, which seems to be the big focus now of Ofsted inspections in particular, is looking at intent, implementation, and impact arrangements. Intent, what does that really mean? Well, it's saying, what does a provider do and why do they do it? Implementation is how they do it, and the impact arrangements are what the learner gets out of the program in the short term and longer term. So it's having some thought as to why are we offering these programs? Is there a justification? Why are we delivering these programs in a certain way? Why are we sequencing the structure of the programs in a certain way? What's going to be the impact? short term and longer term. And when I talk about impact, the impact arrangements, if it's a 3-week employability course, it may be that learners complete the 3 weeks. So we've got a 95% success rate. But what about the longer term impact? You know, what arrangements are in place for perhaps getting 30, 40% of those learners into employment within 6 months? So there's lots of things to look at there. And what I'm saying is, don't sleepwalk into some arrangement. You wouldn't buy a house or a car without looking at it.
I would, yeah, you're right, absolutely right.
What are you investing in?
Yeah, I think there's 3 questions come up there. One is, would that would include the financial information about the provider? In other words, have they got a business continuity plan? What's the finances like? Second one was, do you think some primes might ask for the subcontractors' governance to include independent board members? The answer is absolutely, and exactly, and that's the case where I'm chair of a board where there's 2 of us who are independent board members, which was a requirement of our prime. And the third one from Brian, thanks very much. As part of due diligence, could the main provider ask to check the qualifications of the tutors and lecturers employed by the subcontractors, for example, their qualifications, their experience? And I think the answer would be, this would be absolutely critical, but subject obviously to GDPR and the different rules now on data and the sharing of that data.
Certainly so. You know, just look, for example, if you've got, if you're a prime, or you've got DBS checks on all your staff and volunteers, and anybody who's appropriate within your organisation, you'd want to see the certificate numbers of all staff who are working for the subcontractor who are interacting with learners there as well. So anything you would expect from your own staff and your own organisation, you want to have access to that with your subcontractors, because ultimately you've got to show you're managing this. Imagine a scenario where inspection comes along and the subcontractor hasn't put all their staff through DBS checks who are working with learners aged 16 to 17. Whose fault is that? Is it the subcontractors or is it yours?
And I think although that information might be difficult, I think it is important that you collect it, as long as the individuals themselves who work for the subcontractor are privy to it and understand what the purpose is. So that you know, that information would only be used for purposes of determining what kind of work is given, and obviously that would be also for accountability to other agencies. For example, any quality assurance or external quality assurance, not just Ofsted. It could be the awarding body that needs that information.
You've got to know that as a prime contractor. Don't be intimidated by subcontractors. And I suppose subcontractors shouldn't be intimidated by prime contractors. But I work on the assumption, whether rightly or wrongly, perhaps my years as an inspector brought this to me, presume nothing, check, and double check. Yes.
So the relationship needs to be really well formed and understood.
Certainly, that there's clearly ownership and accountability. You know, that it's clearly, it's expected, you know, what the prime will do in terms of their responsibilities and their accountabilities. Likewise, the subcontractor. So it's ownership of the provision and accountability. That, as we've mentioned previously, subcontractors are partners. You're working together, not simply a distant external entity who are doing their own thing. And as a prime, you haven't really got a clue as to what's going on until statistical data comes through later in the year, which shows that things aren't going particularly well. Support and challenge should underpin the relationship. You know, we mentioned that before, don't we, when we have a governance of an organisation and we say bring in an external person. They're there to support and help improve the provision, but to challenge and ask the difficult questions. And then we've talked about, you know, the move towards very tight contractual arrangements. What I've said about previous subcontracting arrangements is have a clear, unambiguous service level agreement that underpins everything, the rights, responsibilities, expectations. Actually, I've spread this internally to, you know, a college where you've got a college where they have a work-based learning unit and they've got curriculum areas delivering within that college. And I've often said to colleges, why don't you have a clear service level agreement with each curriculum area so everybody knows their rights, responsibilities and expectations, and that makes the organisation pull together and work much more effectively.
I think this also raises, Peter, the way you do this, the way you establish the relationship. And I think a good point that's been made by Becky is that it is seen as partnership. However, I always want to stress that the accountability lies with the prime. Remember, we are responsible for the data. We are responsible for the quality, ultimately, always comes back to us as the primes. But this shouldn't be a sort of dictatorial or an enforced relationship, should it, Peter?
No. We want in that inspection report, that statement, subcontracting is particularly well managed and is planned and delivered to meet the needs of learners and employers.
Yeah, so I think it's important that you know, that there are, you know, if you only go for the heavy-handed compliance model, you could get off to a bad start. I think it's about making people aware of their responsibilities and accountabilities, isn't it?
You know, and it goes back to due diligence. Don't have regrets later. That can happen. We all know that happens in life. But really do your preparation, develop a strong insight into your provider so there are no horrible surprises further down the line.
And don't forget, that also extends to all the other aspects of that relationship, such as safeguarding, prevent, your equality and diversity policy, how you support learners who are at risk. That's got to also be part of that, understanding that relationship and how important those accountabilities are for the prime, which have got to be reflected in the nature of the relationship with the subcontractor.
Seen some great work in those areas by primes, but then when I ask about, and what about the work with subcontractors and promotion to employers, then they tend to be off the radar a little bit. And what we're saying is bring them very much onto the radar.
Yeah, and we've got a suggestion from one listener here that it always helps to have a checklist and sort of simple guide for the subcontracting partner to understand that wider range of responsibilities.
Yeah, you know, we have a learner handbook, we have an employer handbook, you know, subcontractor handbook would be a useful document, you know, electronically to share with, so everybody knows clearly what's expected and that policies, procedures, good practice is promoted across all the provision.
Yeah, and I think that's also going to be interesting for those learners who've got high needs, because obviously there's a subject to significant quality assurance, not just through Ofsted. That obviously is also part of the arrangement you have with a subcontractor. And that, by the way, will be the theme of we're going to have a look at what's happening to high needs learners in the current coronavirus crisis. And that's going to extend to looking at subcontracting arrangements and management fees as well. So we'll pick that up. Good question.
Yeah, interesting area, that, Beej.
So in terms of performance management, where a whole lot of our management time is focused, what are the key considerations we should be taking account of? Okay,
the first one, which is an expression you hear a lot by people, is who takes ultimate responsibility for this? Whose baby is it? Rather than it's all of us who has responsibility, it needs to be somebody with specific responsibility for managing and monitoring subcontractor performance. So we're looking at accountability there. So who does manage the subcontractors? Is it a number of people? It's all pretty vague, or is it clearly structured? What is to be reported upon and how frequently? And I suppose linked to that is what statistics are to be reported upon. So anything you would think is relevant to your own internal provision, that's what you want from your subcontractors. You know, you want to know about base statistical numbers, about numbers on program, retention, achievements, attendance, punctuality. But you want to know about progress made. You want to know that all staff have been through their DBS checks. You want to know what observation grades might have been forthcoming. You might want to get feedback from learners and employers. A lot of statistical information there, but it's giving you an insight into what's happening with the subcontractor. Simply to have a comment, making slow progress, making expected progress, doesn't really tell me anything unless there's something behind that to support those statements. You know, what about auditing and compliance checks? Are you presuming they'll complete their paperwork to the required standard, but do you need to have to check this, and how frequently? Which links on to the next one, quality monitoring visits and information gathering. Do you have meetings? Do you actually go and visit? Do you sample the learner experience? Do you speak with employers? Do you really get to know what's happening with that subcontractor? So you know what's working well and why it's working well and what's not working well, and how that's been identified and what's been done about it and what progress has been made with that. So you've got a clear quality role there to find out what's happening and identify issues before they manifest themselves into something really serious. Because if you leave it to the end of the program, it's too late. That you deal with issues of concern. It's almost having like an improvement plan, an action plan, where an issue is ongoing, and you look back and you think, crikey, this was here 9 months ago, 12 months ago. We've still got this issue of concern. It's dealing with it, it's closing it off, it's seeing progress with it till it's completed, and then we can put that one away. A tricky area is that last one there, managing contract rundown. You know, if I'm a prime contractor and I've got 800 learners of my own, and I've got 100 learners which are subcontracted into me, which group is going to get my priority? I've just put that out to you, and we should say all learners, clearly we should. But if you think it's the ones where I've got direct accountability to Ofsted and the funding body, the ones I've got under that direct contract, and we're coming to kind of contract rundown on the subcontractors, I'm going to focus on what's ours and which is directed towards us rather than what's subcontracted in. Now, you might say that never happens, it shouldn't happen. I know it does happen. It's where the subcontractor loses interest in learners where that contract is being run down and there's no long-term future in that contract. Just be careful and be aware of contracts being closed down, and hopefully successfully.
And a couple of points there you raised. That I mean, one of the things that certainly I've seen, well, what's expected in our relationships with primes, and us as a prime expects from our subcontractors, is that wherever possible, and this is more difficult, I know, for some of the smaller training providers that act as subcontractors, is that their staff, for example, always come to our training on any upskilling, updating on information. Their staff came to our prevent training, our channel training, our equality and diversity training. So we include the subcontractor staff in all of these ways in which we're developing the skills of our own staff. Yeah.
Great partnership working. That feeling of togetherness, that we are, here comes that expression again, all in it together. We're working consistently, we're promoting good practice. It feels like an organisation is working as a true partner with a subcontractor. You know, that last point, I'm going to go back to that last point, managing contract rundown. You know, I speak to some primes where they say, do you know, these subcontractors haven't been very good and we're going to close down those contracts. And I'm thinking, yeah, but what happens to those learners who are still on program in the meantime? We can't let those learners simply fade away. We've got to make sure that learners get a good deal, that complete their program successfully. Otherwise, we've fallen short in everything we've been doing.
Peter, I just picked up a couple of, and we might come back to this, but this is you know, in the last few minutes, I just went to 2 providers that we know, and this was just an example of their statement in their contracts with their primes, you know, between the primes and the subcontractors. So you get that regular and a substantial program of quality assurance checks on the apprenticeship training, apprenticeship provider. This includes visits at short notice, which I know one of you said we do, you know, short notice visits, face-to-face interviews with staff and the students and the learners. That's absolutely critical. That's not just to ensure eligibility and existence, but also it's about finding out what kind of program they're getting. Direct observation of initial guidance, assessment, delivery of training, and on-program assessment. That's the type of thing you'd expect to see, wouldn't you, Peter?
It is. That shows good practice. You know, you'd expect a strong prime provider to be able to give benefit and work with the subcontractor to help them have some top quality, high performing provision. And you can see in that statement there, you're guaranteeing that, you're finding out what they do. You almost, as a prime, create a culture with your subcontractor where there are high expectations. If you're a sloppy prime, should you be surprised?
Exactly.
Subcontractor is sloppy.
Yeah. Well, we sometimes know that from inspection and the outcomes of that. And a further example, this is taken from another provider. I think it's an HE provider, but again, it just shows you they're obviously subcontracting provision. And that's that regular monthly reviews of that sort of data that you talked about, ILR data returns, progress, document, checking the paperwork matches, checking the ILR returns are made on time, but also termly visits to observe delivery across the portfolio of delivery. That looks at quality of IAG, teaching, learning, careers advice, another aspect of this, as well as embedding of safeguard and prevent. So these are just 2 examples of what we would just see as fairly standard but expected ways of primes managing their subcontractors.
When you look at that, it feels strong, doesn't it? It feels as though it's accountable.
And clarity there as to who's responsible for it as well.
Yes.
So to finish off, what are Ofsted's expectations of subcontracting arrangements and management of subcontracting?
Okay, Ofsted don't expect subcontractor provision to be any weaker than that of the prime. So it comes around that if they look at the provision, they want to sample learners and employers who are part of the overall contract, they're going to look at the work of the prime contractor and also the subcontractor. If they find underperformance with the subcontractor, there'll be issues affecting the learner, but the prime's going to take a big hit under leadership and management as poor subcontractor management arrangements. And all the things you've talked about there in the good practice, Beej, they need to be in place to guarantee and support subcontractors to achieve the highest quality within their provision.
Yeah,
and that's
I mean, I think that's absolutely critical, Peter. Sorry.
No, I was going to say, weaknesses with the subcontractor. A prime can't blame the subcontractor and say, they're not very good. The question comes back, what are you doing about it?
I think that's a key point about that last one, about not looking at the subcontractors in isolation. They're actually saying, looking at you and the way you manage that subcontractor. So if, as Peter said, and I just want to re-emphasize that if the subcontractor's weakness, the weaknesses clearly are ones in your management of that subcontractor. You should be aware of any weaknesses they've got. Yeah,
and perhaps how you've learned, perhaps as a provider, as a prime contractor, from previous experience. So if you've gone into subcontracting previously, which was particularly weak, there were poor learner outcomes, how you've learned from that, and how you've put much stronger processes in place now.
So what sort of hints and
okay,
good summary to all of these ideas that we've covered today?
Okay, first point, know why you're subcontracting elements of your provision and that you're doing it for the best intent, that it's for the learner, it's for the learner's benefit. So we're saying there, we're only subcontracting for the right reasons. The third point is to undertake extensive due diligence. Do not sleepwalk into subcontracting. Make sure you're convinced of a clear insight and awareness of the work undertaken by your proposed subcontractor and the benefits that they'll bring to the training provision. Having there, we can call it a contractual arrangement, which I'm sure the ESFA will bring in under the new proposals, but certainly a clear and unambiguous service level agreement. Everybody knows what's expected. That you work to support and challenge your subcontractor. They need your help and guidance. It's not just about the big stick. It's not just about the iron fist. There's a bit of velvet glove in there sometime, because it's what you're trying to achieve, which is the best possible outcome, best possible provision, best possible outcome for the learners. They need your help and guidance. They need your experience. That the performance management and quality assurance has got to be rigorous. Presume nothing. It's got to be active. It's got to be reported upon. It's got to be acted upon. Ensure that when in your own board meetings, that subcontractor performance, subcontractor reporting is a governing body agenda item. So board members are fully aware of what's happening with those subcontractors, so they can challenge if there's any issues of concern. Don't let it be off their radar. Don't hide problems. Share problems. Do something about it.
And I think the point that you've made, Peter, is that the consultation focused on many aspects of this, and some of the aspects, yeah, we agree. We could certainly do with tightening, exposing more of the sort of weaknesses in some of those management arrangements. But I think some of the arbitrary stuff like percentages and geographical, I think are not as strong an element of the proposed changes, partly because some of the evidence is not there. There's no evidence that long distance partnership deals are always arrangements are always bad for the learner. There's no evidence of that. There's no evidence that wholly 100% of provision being subcontracted is necessarily a bad thing for the learners. But I think we've got to understand what the direction of travel is. It's to much better and better quality subcontracting arrangements which benefit learners, and that's the overall, as you said.
Their guidelines need to be justified.
So how can Finn help in this process?
Okay, it's always nice to have a little bit of a giveaway. So what we've got, a very useful document, in fact, 2 documents. One is an essential 10-point checklist for prime contractors. So things they need to put in place, where you are at the moment, and what you need to do to get them to where you want them to be. And there's a 10-point checklist as well for subcontractors. So if you're delivering subcontractor provision, 10 key pointers for you to make sure you're delivering to a high quality. And clearly, people are going to get today's slides. And if you contact the email address at the bottom there, we'll send you the checklists and we'll send you the Finn free monthly newsletter, which I'm sure is exhilarating reading and very informative. But remember, Finn provides a lot of resources to the sector, provides a lot of help, and it's worth considering whether you want to be a member of that organisation.
I think particularly important, those of you who might be new to Ofsted and onto the new inspection framework, is that it's really helpful. And that's why I think we're so pleased that so many training providers have come on today, as well as our colleagues from colleges and local authorities. So that's really good. Thanks very much, Peter. Again, we've managed to stick to roughly to the hour, and we've certainly had plenty of questions. I think we've covered all the questions, and I know that I'll pick up the high needs one, which I think is much more specific, where high needs provision is being subcontracted. The requirements there, of course, are to make sure that that quality of high needs provision, even if subcontracted, is as good as any high needs that might be provided by the prime. But also there are some important issues about high needs in the current situation, which I think we've got to be looking at. I think the key message is the better your management arrangements, particularly where they're shared with the subcontractor. So it's not a top-down approach, but much more of a shared approach, helps because you educate the subcontractor and the staff at the same time. Realize that many of your subcontractors will be seeking direct funding in future. It's useful to go through this process with a good prime and develop your own capacity, etc. And I think we've got, any other questions? Any other questions? Marek, are there any other questions? I haven't.
Just checking. I'm not sure if there's anything that's been missed. I'm looking back down. I can't see anything, but if you know that you've popped a question up there and you're not sure if we covered it, then either just let us know now, or if it's something that we can take offline, we'll be happy to help with.
And I think there's a question about subcontractors who are finding it difficult to get onto the ROTO. How can they earn more provision without going on to full cost provision? There are different openings for subcontractors, particularly smaller training providers, through things like loan funded. I know sometimes, it's a bit of a hassle going on to loan funded provision, but of course that's only available for learners age 19 and over on level 3 and above programs. And of course there are opportunities for you to go on to deliver traineeships for 16 to 24s. But I think that more fundamental set of questions relates to how we open up the market to good quality providers, which of course sometimes can have through the devolved arrangements, where very often the procurement process has meant that some of those subcontractors have now been directly funded. The other thing in response to that question, can I just say that one of the other ways is by maybe those smaller subcontractors coming together and working together to secure access to the ROTO through an appropriate arrangement like that. So again, I think there are a range of solutions there. We've got thanks from a governor that's thanking us for Peter's suggestions. Thank you for that. We also got thanks from an owner of a training company for the advice as well. Thank you for that. And I think we've got one. Yeah, one question there is, if a subcontractor is only delivering part of your program, if they're delivering only part of your program, it's still important you realize that they're a subcontractor. So they're a third party. So you've still got to go through that same process. And even if you're delivering 70 to 80%, It's like, for example, when Peter said that we work with, we do all of the apprenticeship, but we subcontract the functional skills to a third party because there's significant numbers of hundreds of learners going through that experience. So again, I would think you would have to have an appropriate subcontracting arrangement if they're delivering, for example, the technical certificate or knowledge and skills towards an apprenticeship framework or standard. And to what extent, from Helen, do they need to do their own SAR or self-evaluation report? Peter, if you've got a subcontractor, how involved would you think they'd be in the self-assessment process?
I think if you're the prime, you'll have your subcontracting training day. So you'll have perhaps a self-assessment training day. And if you do have that, I'd invite your subcontractors to that. So you may be a prime working with 4 or 5 different subcontractors. Bring them to a training day where they can be, you might share a template with them, or they might have their own template which they use, but you want specific information from them, so they do their own, but that content of theirs, you will then take that on board and include in your overall self-assessment report. So yeah, you want their contribution, you want them to evaluate the work that they specifically undertake, but you're going to give them guidance on how to report on that.
Yeah, we've also trained up some of our subcontract staff to do learning walks. Yeah. We've got another suggestion there. Involve the subcontractor staff in a validation of the self-assessment, particularly where they're responsible for a substantial part of it. For example, functional skills. If you're looking, finding a good provider for functional skills only, that obviously, use the sort of obvious networks who might be, for example, it might be a college or a school or a training provider that's got a good reputation for delivering functional skills. English and maths, we work with schools in Cheshire that deliver functional skills for our apprenticeships there. The reason is they were a grade 1 provider of English and maths. So, in terms of study programs and on traineeships. But I think the main thing is to take some of these as takeaways that you can discuss with your teams, but also get in touch with Finn to get the 10-point checklist for primes and the 10-point checklist for subcontractors. That's great. I think we've covered almost all the questions that were posed there. Thank you then, everyone. Peter, can we thank you? We'll close the recording.